So we're in chapter 6, doing Mishnah 8, and it may sound a little different to a lot of what we've been learning so far in this chapter because we're now almost on the other end, if you wish, meaning we've been speaking a lot about the things that a person needs to do in order to be able to acquire Torah, right? That's the theme over here, what you need to do in order to be able to acquire Torah. Whereas this Mishnah sounds almost like it's speaking about what happens once you have acquired Torah. Interestingly, it does not use the word or the expression Talmidei Chachamim, which is what you'd expect, because the whole theme over here is people who are studying Torah. So you'd expect that if we're going to speak about individuals who are, so to speak, at that level, you'd call them scholars. We don't in this Mishnah. Instead, we speak about tzadikim, which is interesting because a tzadik is a sense of the person's development and their character, not only their learning. So there's an important message there, right? That it doesn't matter how much you've learned until you've translated it into what you actually do, because then you can become a tzaddik and then we can address the particular issues that we're going to address today. Now, there are 3 rabbis mentioned in this Mishnah that we're about to learn, and I'm mentioning that up front because it's incredibly unusual that you should quote a series of rabbis in a single Mishnah where all of the rabbis have the same first name. That's very uncommon. So there's got to be something to that, right? There's got to be something to that. So I'm just giving you a heads up about that before we start, that you'll have 3 rabbis in the Mishnah with the same first name. When I say first name, there were no surnames in those days, but you always refer to the person as the son of their father. So it's their first name really that's the same. Okay, so let's have a look. The Mishnah begins quoting Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Mishum Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon bar Yehuda, who is a colleague, a younger colleague of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is the person who put together the Mishnah. So this is one of his colleagues. And he is quoting Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, the very famous, obviously, famous Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. What does he say? Omer, he says, Hanoi v'hakoyach. Okay, so as we're about to see, these are going to be different descriptions of either personality traits or successes that a person might have in their life. So Hanoi v'hakoyach v'ha'oisher v'ha'kavoid v'ha'chochma v'ha'zikna v'ha'seva v'ha'bonim. That's a list of 8 different things. So we'll in a moment unpack what those 8 different things are, but his message is Noe l'tzadikim and noe la'olam. These are things that are befitting for a tzaddik and add value or are good for the world. Okay, so that's the introductory statement. You've got 8 things on this list, and they are beneficial to the individual, to the tzaddik, and they are beneficial to the world. Then he quotes 4 different psukim to support this. Okay, so how do we know this? Because first of all, the pasuk tells us, Ateres iferes seva b'derech tzedakah timatzeh. Now, if we had to translate that quite simply, the crown of an older person is the gray hair, and you find it in the way of tzedakah, the way of either charity or righteousness. Most of the translations put this word tzedakah into the context of tzedek, which is righteousness. Ve'omer, then it tells us that tiferes bachurim koicham, that the beauty of young people is their strength, v'hadar zakenim seva, and the beauty or glory of older people is their age. We'll have to understand that too. Ve'omer, and it says, ateres zakenim b'nei bonim, that the crown of older people is their grandchildren. Everybody will agree with that. Right? But tiferes bonim avoisam, and the beauty of children is their parents. You hope that that's what your children think. Ve'omer, and then the 4th pasuk that he quotes is a very unusual pasuk that doesn't really seem to be on the topic, and that is v'chofra halavana uboisha hachama, that the moon will be humiliated and the sun will be embarrassed. Because Hashem is going to rule over the mountain of Zion and the city of Jerusalem, and to or across from or corresponding to the elders will be honor. Okay, it's a bit of an abstract Mishnah, right? But it doesn't end there, because then Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya Omer, our third Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah, who also was a colleague of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and if I'm not mistaken, I think he actually lived a very long life. So Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya Omer, he says, Eilu sheva midos shemanu chachamim latzadikim, these 7 traits that the sages counted as being relevant to tzaddikim, to righteous people, kulam niskaimu berebi ubebonov, were all fulfilled in Rebbe, that's his colleague, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the author of the Mishnah, and his children. Okay.
Technically, there's 2 different ways of saying it, because 2 and 3 are the opposite way in the Siddur.
Okay, there are different girsas. There's even a girsa that includes another pasuk. So there are different versions of how exactly you lay out the psukim. So, for example, what you've got in the Siddur, that follows the opinion of the Yachin. He puts them in that order. Most other commentaries reverse the order. So that's how you get different views. And as I say, there is even a version of the Mishnah that includes another pasuk, Ateres Zakenim Ashram. Ateres Chachamim Ashram. That the crown of the wise is their wealth. Okay, but it's not in most versions of the Mishnah, so we're going to leave it out. We're going to focus rather on the one that we have. Now, can anybody here count? Please, how many things are on the list? Hanoi, v'hakoyach, v'ha'osher, v'hakaved. How many things are on the list? 7. Try again. Okay. How many? Okay, let's do it together. Hanoi, v'hakoyach, v'ha'osher, v'hakaved, v'hachochma, v'hazikna, v'haseva, v'habonim is 8. And yet at the end of the Mishnah it says, Eilu sheva midos, these 7 attributes that were listed over here were all fulfilled with Rebbe and his sons. So which one is it? I mean, there are 8 on the list. So why does Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya at the end say that there were 7 that were fulfilled? And it also doesn't just say 7, he says, Kulam, all 7 of these were fulfilled in the context of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and his sons. So we've got to work that out. Because there is a list of 8, and yet at the end, it says that there will be 7. There's a few other things that we have to work out, besides the intriguing, what might appear just to be trivia, but it turns out is actually quite relevant. The intriguing fact that there are 3 Rabbi Shimons in this Mishnah, so that's obviously going to be relevant as well. We're going to have to explore why that is. And then, of course, we're going to have to look through these 8 things on the list and try and understand what they are and why it's such a big deal that a tzaddik should have these things. What does it mean that they are no'eh? No'eh means that they are fitting. It's an interesting expression. Should have said something more like toiv, it's good for a tzaddik, or it's good for the world. Why do we use the word no'eh, which means fitting? We've got to understand that. We also have to understand, at the end, when Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya refers to these 7 traits, he calls them midos, he calls them traits. Now, included in that is, for example, wealth. Wealth is not a trait, surely, right? Wealth is mazel. Either you have it or you don't. Koyach. Strength is not a trait, it's a bracha that a person has resilience or physical strength. So what does it mean when he calls all of these character traits? We've got to understand that too. Okay? So there's quite a lot going on in this Mishnah that we have to unpack, but of course you can't start the Mishnah without translating the 8 things on the list, which we have not yet done. So let's do that together. The first one is noi. What is noi? Which is? Not pleasant. Noi is a little bit more than pleasant. Noi is? Okay, so for example, I'll give you a context where you're familiar with it. Exactly, right? When you build a sukkah, there's a custom to put in noye sukkah, which is the decorations. So the things that beautify the sukkah. So what is noi? Noi is beauty. Okay, interesting. Wouldn't have seen that necessarily associated with tzaddikim, so we've got to work out what that means. I also wouldn't necessarily call that a trait. It sounds more like a physical feature. So it also is interesting, we call it a midah. Okay, so there's one. Next one, koyach, strength. Okay, that we know. Okay, oisher, wealth. Kavod, honor.
I never wrote Kabul in my when I wrote it down, that's why I could say it.
Okay, Chokhmah, wisdom. Now there's something that you see, obviously should be associated with tzaddikim, wisdom. That's probably the first one on the list that actually makes sense. Okay, Zikna. Okay, then what's Seva? So Zikna is old age, and Seva, you know what they always say in English? Ripe old age. I don't know what that means. So there is an opinion that says that Zikna is a person in their 70s, and Seva is a person over their 80s. That's usually the distinction between the two of them. Okay? Okay, and Banim, children. Those are the things that are on the list. And these things are considered to be good for tzaddikim. So let's try and understand why. And quite a number of the commentaries say similar things. I'm just going to kind of mold them all together. The first one is, noi doesn't just mean that a person looks physically attractive. When we say beauty, we're not just saying that a person has certain physical features that would be considered in our world handsome or beautiful, right? Rather, noi means, as we well know, that there is a personality that can be a very attractive personality, the kind of individual that people like. You want to be around them. You feel like your life is enriched when you spend time with them. That's really what we mean when we say noi. Now, one of the big and important roles that a tzaddik has to fulfill is at certain times, as the leadership of the community, they have to represent the community to the government or to whoever the leadership happens to be. And noi means that they're the kind of people that even the leadership, the non-Jewish leadership, which very often was the case. Remember, when the Mishnah is written, the Romans are the occupiers of Israel, so you have to deal with the Roman leadership on a regular basis. So noi implies those people who will have the ear of government because they are noi. They're the kind of people that people are drawn to. And so that is no'eh letzadikim. It is beneficial to the tzadikim to have that kind of charisma that gives them access to the leadership. And as a result, it's no'eh lo'olam. It's obviously in our interests as well, because if we have the right people who have the ear of government, that's going to benefit us. So when we speak over here about no'eh lo'olam, you could simply say that means for our world. It will benefit our world, as in the Jewish community. And similarly, koyach. Why is it important for tzaddikim to have koyach, to have strength? Because we don't want weak leadership. We don't want the kind of leadership where, because maybe somebody has a lot of money to offer, or because somebody is a strong man and they're going to throw their weight around, we don't want the kind of leadership that's going to be fickle. We want the kind of leadership who can stand firm and stand strong and express what has to be said and keep people in line, even when it's challenging. That would be good for them as the tzaddikim, and it would be good for us because we'd then have a robust leadership. So that also makes sense. Koyach, strength, makes sense as well. Oisher, wealth. You know why it's good to have tzaddikim with wealth? Reminds me a little bit of the story of the rabbi gets up in shul because they're about to do a big fundraiser in the community, and he says, I have good news and bad news. The new project that we're about to do, the good news is we have all of the money that we need to cover our budget. The bad news is it's sitting in your wallets. So it's helpful if the people who've got the money are tzaddikim, because then the money goes where it should go, and that's to everybody's benefit. That is no'eh lahem. It's good for them because they obviously fulfill the mitzvah of tzedakah, not just fulfill the mitzvah, but they help to grow and build the community. And no'eh la'olam, it has benefit to the whole world because you have good people who are controlling the purse strings. That's going to make an impact on the whole world. It's going to be beneficial to the whole world. Likewise, kavod, honor.
Is that also that they won't be so susceptible to bribery?
Good point. So you could say that they won't be susceptible to bribery, which is practical. Yeah, 100%. And they're not reliant on the community, right? We have precedent for this. We know that when a person is appointed as the Kohen Gadol, so the pasuk uses the expression that says "V'hakohen hagadol me'echav." The Kohen, who is the greatest from amongst his brothers, obviously implying that out of all of the Kohanim, he is the greatest Kohen, and that's why we put him into such an important position. So the Gemara interprets it a little differently and says, HaKohen, the Kohen that you're going to put into this position is going to be the Kohen Gadol, HaGadol me'echav. It will be the responsibility of his brothers to contribute to his wealth, so that he will be a wealthy individual, so that people will, which brings us to the next point, honor him. So not only to protect him from being susceptible to bribery or whatever else, when a person is desperate for money, but to the contrary, when a person has a lot of money, they will naturally have honor, which is exactly the next point, covered, that they'll have honor. And needless to say, when people have honor, then everybody wants to spend time with them. Reminds me of a story, and I can't for the life of me right now remember the name of the chassid, but there was a particular chassid who lived a few hundred years ago, and he was an extremely, extremely wealthy man. Now you have to understand, in the world of chassidim, certainly a couple of hundred years ago, the concept of wealth was anathema. Like, how dare you invest in yourself? Who do you think you are? If you have money, disperse it, give it to everybody else. Like, it was a common saying in those days that you never went to sleep at night if you had cash in the house. You always made sure to give it to somebody else who didn't have what they needed. That was the mentality. And here was this guy who was this really wealthy chassid living in a big mansion and living an extravagant life. And one of his colleagues who didn't live in that same town once came to visit, and he was horrified by the fact that he had this big fancy mansion. Like, what are you doing? This is not the Jewish way. We're not hedonistic people. So he challenged him and he said, how come it is that you've allowed yourself to live in opulence? And he said, it's very simple. He says, this town has a town council. And not everybody on the town council is so religious and so dedicated to the values of Judaism. Now, the town council meets, whatever it is, once a month or once every second month, they meet. And for the prestige of the town council, they always like to meet in the fanciest house in the town. So if I have the fanciest house, then they're going to want to have the town council meetings in my house out of respect for me. But you can't have the town council meeting in my house unless you appoint me to be a member of the council. Which means that I then get to have a say when Yankel is trying to make a wedding for his daughter and the town council does not want to give him funds. I'm sitting in my house presiding over the meeting. I can tell them that they're required to allocate funds for Yankel's daughter or for Shmerel's child's education or for so-and-so who needs food or clothing or whatever the case is. So he says, what do you think? I need a fancy house? I don't need a fancy house. But the role needs the kavod, it needs the prestige, and therefore I have this fancy house. That's what we mean when we say that Oisher, wealth, is good for tzaddikim. And through tzaddikim who have wealth, it's good for the world. That's exactly the opposite of the convention. Usually when people have wealth, it's good for themselves and not necessarily good for the world. I'm going to have a good time. I'm going to enjoy myself. Sometimes you get to be a little bit out of touch even with other people who are going through difficult things, because when a person has wealth, even if they didn't come from wealth, when a person has wealth, they change their perspective. They don't necessarily remember what it's like for other people. So it's good for the person who has the wealth to be a tzaddik. Chokhmah, wisdom, it goes without saying, so I don't think we have to explain very much about that. But age, the two stages, zikna, old age, and seva, which is, so to speak, older old age. So these two elements, why are they so valuable for tzaddikim? This is an interesting point, and we'll have to go to one of the psukim that he brings as proof, just to illustrate the point. But the point really is that as a person ages, one of two things could happen. Either they'll have less to contribute to society because society will discard them, or they'll have this repository of wisdom and society will embrace them. So old age is a benefit to a tzaddik because the tzaddik will be valued by the society. As they get older, so they'll be even more respected, and so people will call on them more for advice and for wisdom. So it's to their benefit as they grow older. They won't be discarded as, almost like a spare wheel in society. And society will benefit from the tremendous experience and knowledge and wisdom that they have to share with everybody else. And then children, again, it's fairly straightforward, right? We understand what the value is to having children, but the message here is not just simply having children, much more so having children who keep those same values. And we'll see that in a moment once we start to go to the psukim. I do want to just quote one or two stories that relate directly to this. So you've got the story of beauty, and you might remember that there is the story of Reish Lakish. Remember Reish Lakish? He started his career as Shimon ben Lakish, who was the highwayman. That's how he started his career. So in South Africa, we'd call him a hijacker. So he was a wild guy, and on one particular occasion, he arrived at a river. Rabbi Yochanan, who was the leading spiritual giant of the time, who was the great sage of the time, was immersing in the river at the exact time that Shimon ben Lakish arrived. Shimon ben Lakish was such an athletic man that he leapt across the river from one bank to the other. And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, wow, imagine if you could take all of that power and all of that energy and direct it into Torah. You know what you would become? You'd become this incredible scholar. And he's like laughing him off. What do I have to do with Torah? I have a lucrative business over here. You tie me down in Torah. So Rabbi Yochanan says to him, listen, I want to ask you a personal question. Do you think I'm a good-looking guy? And it turns out that Rabbi Yochanan apparently was a very good-looking man. So he says, do you think I'm a good-looking guy? So Shimon ben Lakish, yeah. He says, I've got news for you. I have a sister who looks even more attractive than me. If you go off to yeshiva, I'll make a shidduch. So Reish Lakish says, fine. And then he goes on to become Reish Lakish, who is such a great Torah scholar that even though he started so many years after Rabbi Yochanan, who was the leading Torah scholar of the time, he is recorded throughout the Gemara as being the individual who challenges Rabbi Yochanan on all kinds of areas of halacha because he became such a brilliant scholar. So what was the benefit? Beauty. Hanoi. The beauty was the benefit over here. When a person has that sense of humility and dedication to Hashem, they recognize that it's possible to use beauty as a catalyst to bring more godliness into the world, not just to be all self-interested and, as everybody else tends to be, unfortunately. It all becomes about themselves. So, this is true. However, I have to say, it is true to say that tzaddikim have a certain aura or a certain pleasantness about their face. We call it often an edelkeit, that there's a certain refinement of their face. However, you have to also have a little bit of edelkeit of your own to notice. I mean it seriously. Yeah. Not everybody can perceive that kind of thing. If you're very invested in hedonistic realities and pleasures, you may not notice the more refined beauty of somebody that's effectively radiating an inner beauty. So it's just important to know. But I agree completely. Tzaddikim have this unique glow about them, similar to Moshe Rabbeinu, whose face shone to such an extent he had to wear a veil. Now, before we go further to the next story, which is going to be really, really important to our Mishnah, we have to just recognize one thing over here. There's an implied message. By saying that all of these traits are beneficial when they are presented to tzaddikim, the implication is that if there's somebody who's not a tzaddik, and certainly if there's a person who's on the other end of the spectrum who is a rasha, then any of these traits will be negative. So beauty could be a very negative trait if it's in the wrong hands. A person can become very self-interested and arrogant, even though beauty is not of our own making. It's a gift from Hashem. And the same with strength. A person can abuse their strength if they don't have the value system of the tzaddik. And the same with money. Money could be, as we well know, the root of all evil, as people say. Now, that's not something fundamentally wrong with money. It has to do with who's got the money and how their attitude to life will be played out through their money. And the same thing will go to honor. There are those people who recognize that the honor is the honor of what I represent versus those who think the honor is me. I'm some big deal and the whole world owes me something. Very common, by the way, in today's world, where there is an expectation that you have the rights to respect, even if you've done nothing to earn that respect. It's very much part of the modern thinking. And age, as we've already mentioned, and children, if they are based on something which is unhealthy, then age could become, unfortunately, something negative. And children, unfortunately, could be brought up with all the wrong ideals. And again, we don't have to look too far because we know what it is when people bring up their children on a diet of hate and on a diet of rejection of good values. We know what happens. So it's very clear that the implicit message over here is you have to be a tzaddik to really get the benefit out of all of these things. Now, one of the things that we said over here was wealth. And the Gemara records that at one time in history, the two wealthiest people in the world, and the reason that it's important to know this is because by knowing who the one is gives you a sense of how wealthy the other was. So the two wealthiest people in the world at a particular time in the Mishnah's history was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, who's referred to in this Mishnah as the individual who had all of these brachos manifest in his life. And the other person was what the Gemara calls Antoninus, which is the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. He was a contemporary. They have a long story. They literally met as babies. And they had a long friendship, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Now, if you imagine that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is considered as wealthy as the Roman emperor, just try and imagine what kind of wealth they must have had at that time. So Rabbi Yehuda's position was Hanassi. He was the spiritual and political leader of the Jewish people at the time. And he always had to appear in Rome and represent the Jewish people. So they say that in addition to the fact that he could get any, this is in the days before refrigeration, right? They could get any out-of-season fruit, those two individuals, because they were so wealthy. So, nobody had ever heard of such a thing. The whole concept of saying the bracha shehechiyanu is because you don't expect to have a fruit outside of the season, and it's a big bracha that you live from one season to the next to enjoy those fruits. That's why you say shehechiyanu, Hashem's kept me alive for another season. Here, they were able to get produce that nobody else could get because they had that kind of wealth. So they say that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi would wear shoes made out of gold thread. Gold thread. That's what he wore. Just to illustrate his wealth and prestige, the two things we're talking about over here, Oisher and Kavod, two of the things we're speaking about, his wealth and his prestige. Yet the Gemara reports that when Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi passed away, he was able to say with a clear conscience, I never had personal pleasure from any of the things of this world, even to the extent of my small finger. So they say that the gold shoes that he used to wear had no soles. In other words, they're there because I have to show that prestige. I represent the Jewish people. Rome has to look at me as a big knacker, but for me personally, I don't need to have the comfort of those shoes. It's a little bit of a throwback to the parasha we just read, not this parasha, but the previous Shabbos, where Moshe goes to the burning bush, and Hashem tells him, take off your shoes. So I saw it on the Shabbos, and I can't remember who it was from, that says one of the reasons he had to take off his shoes is because this is the beginning of Moshe's leadership. If you want to be a leader, you need to be able to feel the rough pebbles that everybody else is walking on. So that's the message over here. You can wear your golden shoes, but your golden shoes don't have soles because you're not here to serve yourself, you're here to serve the people. And that's really the message that we're focused on in this particular Mishnah. You can have all of these things, and they could either be something which leads you down a path of ego or self-interest and eventually toxic choices, or it could be something which is na'eh, which is beneficial or fitting to you, and na'eh la'olam brings benefit to the world. And that's why it uses the word na'eh, because the word na'eh implies that it causes value to somebody else. Toiv is a little bit too generic. Na'eh means that you're causing value to somebody else. And that's really the message of this Mishnah. And that's why we're calling them over here midos, because it's not about the gifts that we're given. That's not what the Mishnah is analyzing. Rather, the Mishnah is analyzing the character that we apply to those gifts. That's what's interesting. In other words, two people could have the same blessing in their lives, but their midos, their characteristics, their traits about how they relate to those blessings, that will make all the difference too, whether it's just self-interested or whether it's something which has benefit to the world. A tzadik will always have benefit to the world, and that's really the message over here. Okay, so now we've got the overall picture. We've got to have a look at these four psukim, the four different expressions that are used over here. So the first one that we said was, Ateres, how do we go? Ateres tiferes, now I'm getting myself confused. What was the first pasuk? Teres tiferes seva b'derech tzedakah timatzeh. That the crown of age is your grey hair, and b'derech tzedakah timatzeh, you find it in a way of righteousness. Now, the key word in that particular pasuk is the word find, because the implication of something you find is the pasuk Ateres tiferes seva, that the crown of old age is the grey hair. B'derech tzedakah timatzeh, you find it through a path of righteousness. So the key word over here is the word timatzeh, that you find something. Because the implication of finding something, what does it mean you find something? We use the expression, by the way, colloquially, right? We say, I got a metzia. You ever used that expression? I went to the shops and I got a real metzia. What do you mean to say that you got a real metzia? What are you saying? You got a bargain, right? The implication of a bargain is, I didn't expect it. I was looking for something to buy, and guess what? There was something that was reduced. It was on sale. That's a metzia. Likewise, let's say that a person's walking on the street, and the next thing, you find a wad of cash in an elastic band. So there's no way that you could identify whose it belongs to. There's no halachic questions over here. You're 100% entitled to take the money. If it's in a public area and it's got no identifying marks, you got all this money. You're going to say that was a metzia. I found something. So the implication of finding is it's unexpected. In older age, it is unexpected that a person should have recognition, that they should have value in society. It's not the way that societies work, unfortunately. Unfortunately. It's very interesting. On a number of different occasions, starting, I think, maybe it started before, but certainly starting when he celebrated his 70th birthday, the Lubavitcher Rebbe spoke a lot about how bad it is for people to retire individuals at a certain age. Because what happens when you retire people is effectively you say you're no longer relevant in society. And he says, and that's so misguided because these are the individuals who have so much life experience that everybody should be consulting with them. Instead of putting them out to pasture, people should be consulting with them because you need that wisdom instead of having to waste your time re-experiencing the same things. So, but it's not the nature of the world. The nature of the world is that as a person gets older, so people pay less attention to them. Quite a number of years ago, we actually did a project, a friend and myself, we did a project at the different schools, the Jewish schools. And it was all about not judging people, which unfortunately is very prevalent, right? So one of the things that we did is we put up a PowerPoint on the screen and we put up pictures of different individuals with different questions, and the kids had to answer questions about those particular individuals just based on the picture. They had no idea who the individual was. So one of the pictures that we put on the screen was Menachem Begin in his later years. So the question we asked the kids was, if you would see this old man in a retirement home, would you be interested in going over to speak to him? And the vast majority of the kids said no. And then when we told them afterwards, but that's Menachem Begin, they were like, oh, well, that's a whole different story. And the message really was, well, how do you know until you've actually gone and asked and actually had that conversation? You don't know. For all you know, that person is sitting over there might have, in their time, been this incredible business person, a great scientist, somebody who made a difference. You don't know. So the nature of the world, unfortunately, is that younger generations tend to ignore people who are older. That's why it says, "B'derech tzedakah timatzeh," the person who finds them, the person who engages b'derech tzedakah in a righteous path, timatzeh, they will find something in their older years that other people don't experience. They will find that people still respect them. They will find that people still see them as noise, see them as beautiful, meaning charismatic, interesting, attractive, that people want to spend time with them. That is the bracha of a person who lives a righteous life. He then goes on to tell us that tiferes bachurim koicham v'hadar zakenim seva. That the beauty of young people is their energy, and the greatness of older people is seva. Now, in this context, the word seva actually means something a little different. Seva means wisdom or sagacity. That's probably the better translation. In other words, the fact that they have sagely advised, the fact that they have insight drawn on many years of experience. Seva also comes from the word hisyashvus, that when a person is young, they have a lot of energy, but they also lack a lot of patience. So very often when a person is that young and enthusiastic, they're not very settled. And every few months, they've got a new project and a new idea, and they're doing something else, and they've just read a book, and now they're starting a new exercise routine, or a different diet, or another way to put their kids to sleep. I actually saw a very, very interesting piece of research that just came out not so long ago, that all these baby Einstein things actually make no difference to the child's development, right? Okay, so out that goes. I'm sure we'll bring in something new that's going to take it over. So that's the nature of young people, whereas older people, so tiferes bachurim, the beauty of young people is the energy, and you can achieve so much when you have that amount of energy. Sometimes we look at them and we say, phew, I wish I still had that energy. I was at a bar mitzvah last night and I was watching these kids dancing over there, and somebody came over to me and said, I see that you're not dancing. I'm like, listen, I can't keep up with these kids, So Tiferes Bachurim Koicham, they have a lot of energy. But Hadar Zakenim Seva, the greatness of older people is that they're much more settled, meaning to say they know what they understand and believe and what values are. They're not rushing. They don't get excited every time somebody puts out a new bestseller and now you've got to change your whole life. Relax. We'll tell you a little bit about life. And if you put the two together, you have a very healthy combination. And that's a big theme of this Mishnah, because the next pasuk tells us that what? Ateres zakenim b'nei bonim, that the crown of older people is their grandchildren, v'tiferes bonim avoisam, and the beauty of children is their parents. Ultimately, that's what we want. Ultimately, we want to ensure that our greatest, so to speak, crowning glory is our children and grandchildren. Not just because we have a lot of nachas from them, but because they have the same values. And they should look at us and see the beauty in us. Tiferes bonim avoisam. That is a bracha. It's not guaranteed. It's not something that everybody experiences. It's a bracha of a tzadik, and it's a bracha of any person really who invests in ensuring that their children have values rather than that their children have things. So that's a very important message up here. And that's where you get that combination. When you have children, youngsters with all of their energy, who have the respect for their elders, who have the wisdom, you actually get a winning formula. And that's very much what this pasuk is speaking about. By the way, can anybody think of somebody in the Tanakh who had this bracha okay, let's make it easier, in the Chumash, who had this bracha in their life? The Torah tells us clearly that they had this bracha. Meaning to say, B'nei Bonim, that the bracha extended to the grandchildren. Who do we know? Yosef, right? In fact, in Yosef's case, the Torah even tells us great-grandchildren. Because at the end of his life, the Torah tells us that Machir ben Menashe, okay, that's Machir, the son of Menashe. Menashe is Yosef's grandson. Yuldu al Pirkei Yosef. The sons of Machir ben Menashe were born on Yosef's lap. That it means that they were literally brought up. So Menashe is his son, Machir is his grandson, B'nai Machir, the children of Machir, his great-grandchildren, were brought up on his knee. What does that tell you? Here you have Yosef HaTzadik. Frankly, I think the busiest man in biblical history. Okay, and Moshe was very busy also. In fact, Moshe probably was busier because he had to deal with Jewish people. But Yosef was running a country at a time of great economic crisis, balancing the world of being this slave boy who'd become a royal, living in a royal palace where there's a dynasty of royalty. He had a very tricky lifestyle, and he could have easily turned around to say, listen, these are great-grandchildren, no longer my responsibility. I've got a busy diary. And that's why the Torah tells us specifically that his great-grandchildren grew up on his knee, implying that Yosef, with everything on his plate, was so invested in the education of his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren that the Torah attests to the fact that there's an unbroken chain. That's what we're talking about up here. Tiferes Genim, you want to know what's the ultimate, Ateres Genim, you want to know what's the ultimate crown of older people? Grandchildren. Grandchildren who still value the same things that we value. And who look back and say, Tiferes Bonim Avoisam, they look back at their parents and grandparents and say, we take pride in you. That brings us to the last pasuk, the most strange pasuk of them all, which is that the moon will be ashamed and the sun will be embarrassed because Hashem will rule over the world. Well, if we're talking about Hashem ruling over the world, we must be talking about the future. We must be talking about the time of Mashiach. Because sure, Hashem controls the world now, but it's not something that we see. It's something we believe. So to see Hashem controlling the world, that obviously is referring to the time of Mashiach. And at that time, the moon and the sun will be embarrassed. Now, many of the commentaries point out that the moon is a symbol of beauty and the sun is a symbol of power. And so that's part of what we've been speaking about in this Mishnah, is beauty and power, as they are in the conventional world, represented by the forces of nature, the sun and the moon. And they will pale in comparison to, because how does the pasuk end? V'neged Zekainov Kavod. It will pale in compared to the honor that is given to those who stayed the course, those who were dedicated to Hashem, those people who became tzaddikim. They will, so to speak, outshine the sun and the moon, meaning outshine the conventions of what people thought beauty was and wealth was, and by extension, all the other things on the list. Now, there are only 7 things on the list that are really our own character traits. So that's why when Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh says that these are the 7 traits listed, he can only be referring to 7 because children, which is number 8, is not a trait anymore. Okay, so there are 7 elements that are our trait, and those will then affect our children. And so the litmus test of whether we have those traits is, as he says, that kulam niskaimu berebi ubebanov. How do you know that there's the litmus test that all 7 of these traits were part of Rebbe's experience because it's also passed on to his children. That's how you know. So there's 7 traits and 1 test, 8 things on the list. Now, what's significant about this is that the 3 rabbis are all Rabbi Shimon's, and Rabbi Shimon was probably somebody named such because they were named after Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So we have Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda quoting Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai at the beginning, and very often you'll see throughout that period that the people who were Rabbi Shimon's tended to have a similar attitude to their Judaism. Now, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was what the Gemara calls Toirasoi Umanosoi. You know what that means? That means that he was exempt from davening because he learned Torah 24/7. Not just like somebody who went to yeshiva full time, but had a good 6-hour sleep at night and then got up the next day. This means 24/7. This means that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was so dedicated to learning Torah that he's the kind of person who probably snoozed over the books and then continued learning. Not only that, but the Zohar tells us that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai belongs to a very unique category of sages called Bnei Aliyah. Bnei Aliyah means those people who are able to ascend into very, very lofty spiritual realms. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, as a result, was quite divorced from the here and now. He's quite divorced from the things that we believe are so important in life. That's how he and his son could survive for 13 years in a cave, eating just carobs and drinking spring water, because they were completely divorced from the physical. It didn't bother them that they weren't getting the healthy balance of carbs and fats and proteins and all the things that you have to do. They were in such a spiritual state. Now, somebody in such a spiritual state and their students, which are the other 2 Rabbi Shimons in the story, obviously followed a similar path. Somebody in such a spiritual state would say, listen, I don't need this stuff. I don't need beauty. I don't need strength. I don't need money. I don't need respect and honor. I don't need that because I'm living B'nai Aliyah. I'm living in this elevated spiritual state. And the truth of the matter is, why would I want any of those things? Every one of them is potentially a test of my connection to Hashem, because the person who has any of these blessings may very well get caught up in those blessings and will distract them from doing what Hashem wants. So maybe I'll be so busy managing my finances that I won't be able to focus on Torah. Or maybe I'll have this noi that's going to attract all these people to me who are not necessarily interested only in learning. They want to make small talk and they want to connect. I don't have time for that. So you'd imagine that somebody like a Rabbi Shimon character, which represents a character of an individual who is so divorced from this tangible world, you'd expect that they don't want to have any of these things. They would never see them as an accolade. And yet these are specifically the rabbis, because remember, the Mishnah starts by Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda quoting Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. That means that the origin of this Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the person who cared the least for honor and wealth and beauty. He's the one saying, and all of these things are valuable for a tzadik. Why? Because Hashem doesn't want us to float around as disembodied souls. The reason Hashem put us on this earth is to be able to engage the things that physical life have to offer and to use those things as a catalyst to be able to get closer to Hashem and as a result elevate the physical to become holy. Therefore, your knee-jerk reaction as a great tzaddik might be, cut me out of the wealth or the whatever it might be. I just want to focus on asceticism and meditation and speaking to Hashem and davening and learning. And the message is, it's not about you. It's about what Hashem wants. And Hashem wants somebody who has that level of clarity and that level of attachment to dafka engage with the physical so as to elevate it and hopefully then send a message and teach a lesson to the rest of us. And that's the conclusion of the Mishnah, that it's a lesson for the rest of us. Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh says, all of these traits were fulfilled in Rebbe's experience and that of his children. Now, first of all, by telling us all of these traits, it's quite surprising because some of them are actually contradictory. For example, we've got Chokhmah, which is wisdom, referring here to Torah wisdom, and we have Koyach, which is strength. Now, if you remember the end of the Reish Lakish story, after he agrees that he's going to go learn Torah, he tries to jump back over the river, and he can't. And he says to Rabbi Yochanan, I don't understand what's happening. Rabbi Yochanan says, you've accepted the responsibility of Torah. Torah matisha koicha shel adam. The nature of Torah is that it physically weakens a person. So previously you had all this power that you could jump over a river, but now you've committed to the Torah, you will become physically a little weaker. So it does sound contradictory that you could have Chokhmah and Koyach, that the same person could experience both. Or likewise, there's chokhmah, Torah, wisdom, and there's wealth. Now we know very well that the vast majority of Torah scholars were not wealthy people. And very often we say that there's, this breakdown between the physical wealth and spiritual learning. So that's the greatness of Rebbe. Rebbe was blessed that he had all of these experiences in his life, even those that apparently contradict each other, in meaning to say he was this incredible scholar and he had incredible strength, which is unusual. Now, the fact that Rebbe had that, we know. In fact, Rebbe is used as an example of an individual who his body never decomposed. And the reason for that is because the only way a body decomposes is because it experienced personal pleasure in this world. And because Rebbe never experienced personal pleasure in this world, his body never decomposes. So he's a great example of somebody who's completely dedicated to what Hashem wants, and he could have all of these accolades in his life without them sucking him down into something negative. But the real kicker of this Mishnah is Rebbe Ubanov and his children. Now, his children became very significant people in Jewish history, right? The leadership of the next generation. And yet here we're not talking about them as the great rabbis they became, just simply as his children. And that's got a very important message for us, because Veshinantam livonecha v'dibarta bam. We say in the Shema every single day, you should teach it to your children, teach the words of Torah to your children, and they should speak the words of Torah. The Gemara says that pasuk, livonecha, your children, means elu hatalmidim. It means your students. And therefore, the veiled message of Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh at the end of this Mishnah is that Rebbe and anybody who is willing to be his student, any person who is dedicated, that's why it doesn't list the names of his children, nor does it speak about them as great individuals. It speaks about them purely as children of Rebbe. And every one of us could be a child of Rebbe, could be a student of these values and a student of these principles, and could equally live with all of these brachas in our lives, and all of them directed to serving Hashem instead of serving ourselves. That's why it does not call him here Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, but rather much more generic term, Rebbe, teacher of the Jewish people. Because the message is that any one of us could be his student, and every one of us should aspire to be his student, and every one of us should look to have these traits in our lives merely as a means to serve Hashem, in which case, you might say, we find more bracha, please God, in our lives.